I think about community is how we take care of each other and how we will transform our city into a more safe, affordable, equitable, inclusive, accessible, transit-rich, climate-resilient city where we can all thrive.
That is Seattle's newest council member, Eddie Lynn, sworn in this week ceremonially as he takes over the District 2 seat in Southeast Seattle from Mark Solomon. D2, it's the most diverse district in the city. So what kind of diverse views does Councilmember Lynn bring to the city of Seattle? Plus, Mayor-elect Wilson's team continues to expand. We're hearing about some of her close cabinet members coming up here. Also, a whole new slate of requests made by the city of Seattle to state lawmakers as the session in Olympia is just about to get underway. All this and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I need to ask, are you a carefully measure out Thanksgiving turkey leftovers over the whole week? Are there no leftovers remaining? Does your family even have turkey at Thanksgiving? What do you got?
We had turkey at Thanksgiving. I was at my sister's, though, so the rules are sort of, if you host, you get to keep the leftovers. So
this is true.
No leftovers in our house.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Good to know. Thank you very much, David. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. If you can, please do support the show, starting off at just $5 per month, just over $1 an episode. What a deal there. Also, you will get access to Patrons First podcast before anybody else and your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. Awesome. Plus, patrons, do keep an eye out on your email. The first ever Patrons Appreciation event is coming soon at City Hall. Be on the lookout for that. If you want to be part of the fun, head to Patreon online and support Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, a big thanks for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. Let's go. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, here we go. Eddie Lynn was ceremonially sworn in this week as Seattle's newest council member. He's been on the job since last week after election results were certified. He's in a little more quickly than you might expect because he's taking over from Councilmember Mark Solomon, who was just serving an interim role after the sudden departure of Tammy Morales earlier this year. David, we touched on this last week. Lynn is a bit more of a progressive politician. When I talked to him on the campaign trail, he was definitely on board with finding ways to tax the wealthy, find progressive revenue sources there. He had a lot of concerns about the addition of surveillance cameras in his district, too. And it just raises the question for me. I brought this up about D2 being the most diverse district in the city. How tough is it to represent all of its facets there, from Chinatown ID to Rainier Beach, Columbia City, Mount Baker? I know every council member and every council job is tough out there, but this one just feels like it has a lot of really different constituencies to it, ones that might support his positions on progressive taxation and surveillance cameras and ones that might not. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, District 2 has leaned pretty progressive in recent elections. Tammy Morales, even in the 2023 wave year of moderates, Tammy Morales managed to beat Tanya Wu for that race and was pretty much the only progressive that survived that election. So it does tend to lean more progressive. Katie Wilson, when you look at precinct maps, did pretty well there. And he won with, I think he had 68% of the vote. So it was pretty overwhelming, despite the fact that you could make the argument that there weren't huge differences between Eddie Lynn and Adonis Ducksworth on the campaign trail.
Both good candidates, yeah.
It is a complex district in that, the Chinatown International District in particular, I think is, among the neighborhoods that City Hall has kind of struggled to wrap its arms around the most. It was an issue that was frustrating people towards Mayor Bruce Harrell. I just think there's a lot of frustration towards City Hall generally among people who live and work in Chinatown International District. So, I think that is probably in some ways his biggest responsibility is what do we do, particularly around 12th and Jackson? What is the answer there? But, Little Saigon in particular and Chinatown. But then, Rainier Avenue. Oh, yeah. He mentioned this in his speech that he gave. It is disproportionately the most unsafe street, one of the most unsafe streets in Seattle, and District 2 in particular sees the most traffic deaths out of any district. So that you could kind of go down the list, honestly, of issues that are struggles in Seattle, and you will probably find disproportionate representation of those in District 2 between gun violence and traffic deaths and homelessness and things like that. And so, it's in some ways kind of the weightiest district to represent because it is the only district that's not majority white, as you said, and just is disproportionately represented in a lot of categories that you don't necessarily want.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Second question on Len. He really does know his way around City Hall, working with the city attorney's office, was focused on the Office of Housing mainly when he was there. How confident are you in his ability to produce legislation, get it through committee, etc.? I'm asking this because we've touched on this before. This is still a relatively inexperienced council. You got Councilmember Strauss that served one full term, plus about a year or so now, and then Councilmember Juarez, an interim for D5, who's gone after next fall. She has 2 terms under her belt, but that's it. And I'm just thinking back to 2 years ago, we saw the biggest turnover in a century on the city council with these new members coming in. And I'm just wondering if Eddie Lynn is going to be a stabilizing force at City Hall for the council. What do you think?
Yeah, there's always a learning curve for people coming in, at, particularly on budget. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Eddie Lynn is currently the head of the land use committee. I don't know how long that'll last because they'll choose a new president and probably shuffle committee assignments. But it kind of makes sense that he would have that job because, as you said, he's a lawyer. He's been in City Hall for a long time, but he specifically did a lot of work for the Office of Housing around land deals and affordable housing development. And I think that's going to continue to be a really big issue in Seattle. Of course, there's housing levies and payroll tax and a lot of money to be spent on housing, but also just pretty intense issues in the affordable housing sector that will probably require some attention from this council. And so whoever the next president will be, considering the level of inexperience on this council, you could see them kind of trying to tap the skills that he does have, which is he knows his way around a land deal. And, as a lawyer, he probably knows his way around writing legislation, too.
Right.
What he doesn't know is the politics, because you don't really need to be a politician as a assistant city attorney. But I think the expertise in city government and kind of understanding of what kind of legislation can pass from a legal standpoint, I certainly do think that will be helpful.
Yeah, I do too. And I'm very interested to see what happens with his housing background too. So interesting to see what's next for Eddie Lynn as a council member. And we do have an update this week also about Mayor-elect Wilson and her staff in 2026. These are going to be the permanent positions beyond her transition team. David, I know this can turn into a lot of inside baseball pretty quick here when we start talking about names. You got Brian Surratt as deputy mayor, Ali Panucci back as budget director here. What about this team stands out to you?
I think what stands out to me is, I think it's pretty intentional, particularly if you look at her 3 executive team members who, again, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but when you talk about Brian Surratt, Jen Chan, and Katie Cruiser, I think that's how you say it, that feels like a pretty intentionally balanced group of people because not Katie Cruiser, Kate Cruiser, is a longtime ally and close friend of Mayor-elect Wilson. Mm-hmm. She was a treasurer of the Transit Raiders Union. And so in her, she has kind of this close ally that she probably trusts a lot. But in Brian Surratt, she has somebody who, as far as I can tell, she did not and really does not have any kind of prior relationship with. My understanding from people I've talked to is the first kind of contact with Surratt came after the primary. He seemed to kind of volunteer his services. And so Surratt is somebody who, as one person described to me, really doesn't have any enemies in Seattle, which, I think there's good things and bad things to that. Sometimes you have to make enemies to do what you want to do. But I think Mayor-elect Wilson in Brian Surratt recognizes somebody who can sort of ingratiate himself into a lot of different, who can fit in a lot of different rooms because he's the CEO of this Greater Seattle Partners nonprofit, which is basically pro-business investment firm in Seattle. He sits on the board of the Downtown Seattle Association, which is, it's John Scholes, of course, supported Bruce Harrell. He also sits on the board of the Downtown Emergency Services Center. So this is a guy who kind of has a lot of fingers in a lot of pots. And I think, as one person described him to me, I think he'll be kind of Wilson's vice president in a way, which is when she can't appear somewhere, he would be the kind of face of that office.
I could see that too, because he is the one deputy mayor, whereas Bruce Harrell had multiple deputy mayors. Mayor-elect Wilson is going with this one deputy mayor and branching out her cabinet in that way. Did you notice that? I thought that was an important distinction there.
Yeah, and that's intentional. That was a recommendation after she did so well in the primary. Her campaign solicited this memo from a lot of City Hall alumni, basically that all made this recommendation for how she should structure her office, and she appears to be following it pretty much to a T. Their argument was that this structure of having all these different deputy mayors kind of created silos and competition and factionalism in the mayor's offices, because Harrell had that, and Jenny Durkin had that too. I don't remember what Ed Murray had, but they had these different deputy mayors who were responsible for different departments.
Yes.
They kind of argued you shouldn't have that. You should have one deputy mayor who can kind of act as your vice president and then more specific roles. And she seems to be doing that. I think it's notable. For example, now you have Jen Chan, who is in charge of overseeing all of the department heads, which is much different than you'd had before. Again, I know we're getting into inside baseball here, but the thought is, and they're saying this outwardly, the thought is that they want to take better advantage of the kind of expertise that exists within these departments. And they fear that by, having this person have these 5 departments and this person have these 5 departments, you sort of lose the coordination that could be possible between these departments. So the thought is by giving it to one person, you can kind of better, because a housing legislation might actually touch a few different departments. You want to be able to have all those people communicating. That's the kind of hope here. It all sounds great in a vacuum. As Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So we'll see what happens come January 1st if all of this actually works.
Indeed we will. Thank you for that, David. All right, well, coming up, the city of Seattle has performed its annual duty of sending its list of priorities to our state legislators. What's on that list? What kind of priorities are Seattle state reps and senators talking about in Olympia as well? Some more details next on Now Hear This. Well, every year, the city of Seattle, through the city council, sends a wish list of sorts, an agenda to the state legislature when it comes to city priorities. These are the things that the city of Seattle wants. This year's list is a little bit different in that it's very much pressing on the state substantially to respond to cuts in federal funding. Here's a part of what city staffer Anna Johnson of the Seattle Office of Intergovernmental Affairs was saying about this list of needs from the city earlier this week at a council briefing.
We're looking to mitigate losses of federal funding for essential services like food access, housing and shelter, Medicaid and immigrant services. We're also asking for state support for the Seattle King County Public Health Clinic to ensure access to essential health services for uninsured and immigrant communities, and then also maintain funding for asylum and migrant support services.
David, no surprise to me in terms of what the city is looking for here, and I don't think for you either, but I am wondering how successful this lobbying really is going to be, especially in light of the fact that the state is facing a $7 billion budget deficit for the next 2 years. How much room do you think the state is going to have to move here, especially when you consider it's a short session coming up, just 60 days? They're supposed to be making small changes to the budget, not major adds. Help me out with this whole list of priorities that the city of Seattle is sending to the state and how the state can respond.
You're right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these require money. And absent a sort of strong opposition party in Olympia, a lot of the fights happen among Democrats down there. And the fight happening already, even before session has started, is around this budget piece. Sean Scott and Rebecca Saldana are pushing for basically a statewide version of the Jumpstart tax.
Right, the tax. Yeah, payroll expense tax like Seattle has. Keep going, right.
Which I think they said would raise something like $3 billion, so it wouldn't close the gap, but maybe you can fund some of these priorities.
Right.
At the same time, the last session saw a pretty big tax package, and Governor Fergus is saying that he doesn't want to go down that route again. He's saying he wants to find cuts. And so, he's the governor, so his word carries a lot more weight than Representative Scott or Senator Saldana's, but it is going to be kind of a debate, and whoever ends up winning, I think, will dictate what Seattle gets from the state. I think the piece that they have in their favor is that in a lot of ways, Governor Ferguson is governor because of the identity he created for himself as an opposition to Trump.
Sure.
That was, specifically when he was attorney general. His entire thing, how many times he had sued and won Donald Trump and beat Donald Trump. So, I think of any issues that he's going to be sympathetic to, one of them is going to be cuts from the federal government and the impact that that's going to have on communities. So I'm skeptical that we're going to see any sort of significant new funding out of the state at all. But there is a fight to be had there. So we'll see.
No, you're right. And Representative Scott was talking about this from the 43rd district. So kind of the central north part of Seattle up into Montlake, et cetera, Capitol Hill as well. He was talking about this and really the idea that the dollars raised from this, again, in between $2-3 billion potentially, would go into a Washington fund, really trying to protect some of the people who might be affected by slashing Medicare and things of this nature here. So I think there is an idea for that. But I just remember this from last session as well. The governor has been very reluctant to do something like a wealth tax. That was a big part of the Democrats' plan last year. The governor kind of took the air out of that one, and then from what I'm seeing this week, he's like, nope, I got a cuts-only budget coming your way. And I don't know, maybe that's part of the political dance here. We'll have to go back and forth with that. Do we want to see all these cuts? Is it going to involve something, a pushback against the federal government? Is there a lawsuit where the state can somehow recover some of those federal funds? A lot of this just feels very up in the air right now, even before the session, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably worth knowing. I haven't heard a lot about a wealth tax. I haven't, of course, don't pay as close attention to it, but I think there's kind of an understanding that a wealth tax logistically and perhaps legally is not an immediate path to closing any sort of budget deficit. But yeah, I think this question around a statewide payroll tax will be salient. But Governor Ferguson, I would say, for my money, I still don't entirely know what kind of governor he is. I'm not sure he defined himself super clearly in the first legislative session. I think a lot of people feel that way, and because I think some progressives had some hope for him, but now he seems to be coming out as a much more kind of moderate presence. Yeah. Though certainly not moderate enough to win over Republicans. He's kind of in an interesting position here.
Yeah, I think so too. And last touch on this, I noticed right after this proposal from Sean Scott and Rebecca Saldana came out, you've got people like Washington Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce from the Seattle metro area and Bellevue saying, no, this is bad for business. It's going to hurt everybody in terms of taxes. We're talking about new taxes here after a session last year for the state where they raised taxes higher than ever. And what are we doing this time around? I hear what's happening there in terms of that pushback, but at the same time, I always come back to this piece too. This whole concept of taxing the rich, taxing the wealthy, taxing those who have more essentially is very popular in the state of Washington, certainly popular in Seattle. Does that enter the fray at all in terms of what, the governor's talking about, what the legislature is talking about too?
For sure. I think the reason that the legislature was able to do the tax package that it did last year was because in part because of the referendum that was put on the ballot to repeal the state capital gains tax, which was pushed by Brian Haywood, who is kind of a conservative initiative activist. But because that failed by such significant margins, and in places that I think there were counties that voted for Trump that rejected
that's right.
A repeal. What it really kind of backfired on Brian Haywood, because what it did is, coming into last year's session, it told Democrats that this is an extremely popular political issue to tax the rich and corporations. Yeah. That assumption has not been challenged yet, as Katie Wilson's election shows. Not to mention the election of Eddie Lynn, as we were just talking about, because Eddie Lynn was actually the first thing he did when he was on council was push them to add to their state legislative agenda a line about pushing for more progressive revenue. So they are not being shy about pushing for that. At the same time, there has been some acknowledgement even from Mayor-elect Wilson that some companies appear to be reacting to these taxes in a way. Amazon seems to not be growing as quickly in Seattle as it is in Bellevue. Yeah, Mayor-elect Wilson has tied that to the Jumpstart tax, despite being a big backer of it. Yeah. What was it? Swedish hospital just laid off a bunch of people, and one of the things they said in that was because of the new taxes in the state. It's hard to totally fact check everybody on these claims, but it is being thrown around as a reason for some businesses' struggles. And I think at a certain point, I have to think that would break through. It certainly has for Governor Ferguson. Yeah. So, again, if he's firm in how he approaches his budget, it's hard to see a way around that for the legislators. But you're right. I mean, it hasn't been a political losing issue yet, or at least not for a while.
Yeah, fair. Back to a city budget concern I wanted to talk to you about. I saw a piece in Public Cola earlier this week talking about the Seattle Police Department and how much it is spending on overtime. Turns out it's quite a bit. This coming from a city memo back in mid-November that says the SPD has to, quote, drastically reduce its overtime usage and costs in the remaining weeks of the year to address a projected budget overrun. So it's talking about no OT for property crime investigations through the end of the year. Basically, it has to be a life-threatening event or something like that, and all overtime usage has to be approved, even if it's overtime in authorized categories. I guess this is a function, David, of paying officers more than anywhere in the state and tacking on a 13% raise a few weeks ago. What do you make of this when it comes to overtime? Because I know the SPD has had issues with this before in terms of its spending.
Yeah, I think there's that, which is, the pay has gone up. The other piece is just, honestly, SPD kind of does this every year. I think maybe this one is a bigger miss, but they pretty much always or at least for the last 5-6 years, they've always overspent their overtime budget, which, I think is partially a function for sure of the fact that they just don't have as many officers. So they are really relying on overtime. It does kind of, it should be pointed out that this is of all the departments in the city, this budget is the friendliest to the Seattle Police Department.
Yes.
A $40 million bump in their budget, while most other departments either see no bump or a cut. So it's not like City Hall is totally neglecting their budget or anything like that.
Yeah.
I think there is a kind of interesting piece here, though, where, legitimately there has been a pretty significant hiring uptick, which of course you have to pay those people. But there's something like a year plus lag between when you actually were going to hire those people and when they are officers on the street and fully functional officers. And so part of the reason that the police department is getting the bigger budget that it is because they have hired so many people, but not that many of those people that they've hired are actually out on the streets working as police officers. So you've got the situation where you're paying people who are not working. And so therefore still relying on overtime. I don't know what the way around it is. And my sense too is that both the state academy and the local training program are stretched pretty thin here, which is they're not moving officers through that as quickly as they would like. It is a little bit of a conundrum.
No. Is there any way to control it going forward? Because in this report, the budget actually for SPD next year said we're going to assume police will use fewer hours of overtime because hopefully some of these new officers will come on board, I'm guessing. But I'm just thinking about like the World Cup alone. Maybe that's not a good assumption. What do you think about this overtime situation? Again, you're right. This really does come up every year. Is there a way to control it, do it differently going forward, or what do you think?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I could be mayor. Because again, it's like every year there's some meeting and someone on city council gets frustrated because the SPD is spending more than it was given. But the reality is it's much easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And this is not a council that's gonna like withhold money from the Seattle Police Department. Again, they get $40 million more in this budget, which is the biggest boost of any department. So honestly, no, don't see a way around it except for, pray that there's not a lot of property crime this year, I guess.
Yeah, gosh. Oh, boy. Well, we'll see what happens there. Thanks, David. Coming up, another battle over public safety in a different sense, as a beloved part of Seattle's past and present is now at the center of a major lawsuit. We're going to explain coming up on What's Next. Well, Gasworks Park on the north side of Lake Union is the site of what some would consider an architectural icon, rusting metal towers that were once used to create gas that was used to provide power to homes and businesses in Seattle from 1906 to 1956. Well, of course, those buildings are still there. People love them. They're in that area of that park, and people have admired them for many years since. But now they're in the middle of a lawsuit after 15-year-old Matthias Johnson climbed atop one of the ladders, fell 50 feet to his death back in July of this year. Now his parents, at the end of October, they filed this. His parents are asking the court to name the gasworks as a public nuisance. This is the third death at the park since 2012. David, you're not a lawyer, neither am I, but how do you look at this court case? I just thought this was very interesting. I know people have called for the closure of this park or removal of these gasworks apparatus before.
The piece that I pick up on the most is actually the historic preservation piece of this, which is that this family, I think it was this family, but it had kind of pushed the city to, it's not that they're advocating for removing the towers completely. They're saying that the city should go through and take off all of the ladders and the steps that are on them, which are what people use to climb and often fall. But there has been obstruction on this from the preservation boards who don't want to see it touched. And that to me is kind of the essential conflict here. I'm not a sort of heavy preservationist guy. I don't, if it's a choice between keeping this park or this piece there at all and removing a few of the ladders,
right
seems like a pretty good deal to me personally. But I and it's such a tragedy, and if there was but at the same time I don't want to make it sound too simple. I know the city has tried to do a lot to protect this, and it hasn't
fencing
really
and all that, but people cut through it and all this kind of business, right?
But again, I would imagine if you're the family here, I can sympathize with feeling frustrated that what could to some seem as a simple fix, which is to remove the ladders and the steps from this, is proving to not be that.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out what that middle ground is to preserve this park and keep it safe. I hear what you're saying. Like maybe there is going to be that court case down the line where you got to tear the whole thing down rather than that middle ground being maybe you can just get rid of the ladders, I guess. I'm wondering what that would look like.
Yeah, because if you look at it now, there's like these kind of spiraling staircases going around.
Right.
I think the proposal is just take those off, but the preservation board sees that as an essential piece of what those are, and so they don't want to do that. I don't know. Again, historic preservation fights and environmental fights like this tend to be some of the kind of wonkiest and most complicated. I don't know where it goes from here, but certainly if it gets condemned as a public nuisance, that is not great for the people who love the park, but at the same time, if people continue to die there, then and the city won't do anything about it, you can understand how the family would feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, difficult story there. We'll see where that one heads, but it is time to wrap up, David. Some gardening advice from you, if I could. I always try to lean on this with you during the tough months of the season. I did my last lawn mowing of the season this year in the rain a few days ago, felt very proud of myself, but it was such a struggle, and I always wonder, was it worth it? Should I have just let it get all long and mushy and terrible over the winter, or just it's short and mushy now? It's just going to look pretty gross either way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't mowed my lawn in a few months, mostly because
flex.
It doesn't seem to be growing, and so it's a good question. Well, you'll give it a little fertilizer, I suppose, with the grass clippings. That'll feed it come spring when it's ready to sprout again. Okay. I was hoping there was some silver lining to this very, very foolish slog that I did a few days ago. So thank you, David. As always, thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. If you like what you're hearing, please do become a patron, support the show. Head to Patreon online, find Seattle News, Views, and Brews, pledge $5 a month or more, and thank you very much for your support. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen, we are there. Thank you for watching on Converge Media 2. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.